Not too long ago, we painted up some Thousand Sons Terminators, and these guys we had to paint up relatively quickly. We had a squad of 5 Terminators that we needed to paint up in time for a video. But what happens if we are able to spend a little bit longer on our models? Well, today we're going to be finding out as we paint up the Infernal Master from the Combat Patrol of the Thousand Sons, spending roughly the same amount of time on this one model as we did on the 5 other Terminators. So we're going to be starting off with roughly the same sorts of paints and techniques that we used, but just honing them a little bit further. And that does mean that we'll be starting off with a zenithal prime using a red and a blue spray. This prime is very similar to the normal zenithal priming method, except we're going to be swapping out the black spray as the base for a red spray instead. And then we're going to be hitting the model from above using a blue prime. First, we're going to want to build out a little bit of colour in the lower areas, which after the prime is just plain red. And in order to do this, what we're going to do is go through and dry brush in a little bit of turquoise. And this is going to be hitting all areas of the model, catching all the raised areas in both the blue base coated areas as well as the red base coated areas. Once this dry brush round is done and complete, we can then come back in and do another round of dry brushing, but this time we're going to be using a light flesh. This time we want to make sure that we are doing it in a directional manner. So generally we're only striking it from the top down, meaning that we will have this light skin in the areas where light would hit the most, and pretty much none of it will be in the undersides where we have the red shadows. We want to break these steps up deliberately, and the reason we're doing this is because by adding in the blue into all of the red recesses that we've essentially got, we're going to be harmonizing those colors with the rest of the area on our next steps. And then we've got the light flesh that's only going to be hitting the model from the top down, where there's going to be the most amount of light hitting those models, and it will give that inference of those bright spots of light. When we come in and do our next step, which is going to be using some contrast, I've got Celestian Blue here to go with the rest of the models that use the same color, and we're going to be thinning this down with some contrast medium, which will have a couple of benefits. First, it will smooth out all of our dry brushing textures, as well as giving us a nice decent base coat color to work from, so that when we come in, if we make any mistakes later, we can start from this stage and then work upwards, meaning that we can go in and actually correct any possible errors. We want to apply the diluted contrast over all of the armor, and then once that is dry, we can come in and start doing our rounds of highlights. And to do this, what we're going to do is add a little bit of turquoise into our contrast, and then use this as our highlight color, slowly adding more and more turquoise into the mix, doing progressively thinner highlights with each pass. At a certain point, we are going to get to essentially pure turquoise, and at this stage in painting, we'll be aiming to get roughly very narrow edge highlights and panel highlights, but enough room for us to push it a little bit further. Because what we're going to do is take a little bit of mid skin tone, mix this into our turquoise to give us a slightly brighter hue, and use this as a final edge highlight on all surfaces. Then we can actually finish off the armor if we want to do a little bit of bright spots by adding in some light flesh into our last mix, and applying this to the sharpest, brightest edges and essentially doing some spot highlights. This is one of the main areas of difference between the Terminators that we painted and this particular model. On the Terminators, we needed to paint the armor relatively quickly and get some punchy contrast in brightness and hue. And we did that over a course of 2 or 3 layers, basically going from a base coat to a mid-tone to a highlight. Whereas here, we've got the time to spend that progressive amount of transition layers to build up a nicer blend from our recessed color up to our brightest highlight. And we've also got the opportunity to push those highlights a little bit further so that we get a nice brighter spot colored leader, which is always a nice addition. With that done, that is mostly all of the armor done in the sense of the traditional blue Thousand Sons armor. So we can move into blacking out all of the other details so we can paint those separately. We want to grab a black contrast and use this paint to block around all of the details on the model that we're going to be painting any color that isn't essentially brown leathers or any yellow areas. So here we can aim to target all of the general metallics. However, we will want to avoid the weapons if we're going for a special technique that we're using later on. Once all of the trim and other details have been blacked out, we can tackle the armor trim itself. And this will be started off by applying a dark gold tone, and we want to put down a clean coat of this all over the armor trim before we look to take a brighter gold and start to mix this into our previously used darker gold. This will give us a nice metallic mid-tone, which can then be used to highlight all of the metallics in both an edge highlight and panel highlight manner. When we're highlighting, it is always worth considering the model shape that we're applying our highlights to and how light would interact with those areas. So for example, a cylinder is going to reflect light and have a different reaction to light than a square or a sphere. And we just want to make sure that when we're going in and doing our highlights, we make sure they're aligned in the sense of the highlights we've done on the blue armor, as well as the highlights we're doing on the trim. Now, in regards to the trim, we naturally made up a mid-tone using a dark gold and a bright gold, and that was used for our first set of highlights. And what we're going to do now is come in and do some more highlights using just the straight gold for that bright gold punch. We want to take this bright gold and then work around the model, picking out all of the edges of the metallic areas, such as the trim that we've been painting and any of the emblems. This is essentially then the trim sorted, and we can move across to any of the other areas like the leathers and the weapons. These are all going to be given a coat of a brown contrast, which is going to act as our base coat for the following steps. Starting with the leathers, it's going to be a nice and simple process. What we're going to be doing is adding in a little bit of golden brown into our contrast that we used as a base coat, then coming in using this in our first set of highlights, slowly adding more and more of the golden brown, highlighting all of the raised areas on the leather. This can then be followed up with just essentially pure golden brown, and here we're going to be doing a broad edge highlight, allowing us to finish off any of the brown areas by mixing in a little bit of light flesh into our pure golden brown and using this to do a very thin edge highlight. This essentially covers off all of the leathers. We've naturally got the tabard as well as the pouch on the model, but we also use this same technique and painting style and paint recipe for the wooden sections of burning pyre on this particular model's backpack. Obviously, this backpack isn't on every model, so that's bespoke to this guy. Either way, that is the leathers sorted, and now we can move on to the exciting element of the weapons, which we're going to be painting in a semi-ethereal Zinch-like manner, and that's why we needed to start off with our brown contrast. Assuming our brown contrast is dry, we can start off, and here we're going to grab a dark gold, and we're going to use this to broadly highlight all of the chosen areas. What we're aiming to do is leave the matte brown in all of the recesses, but all of the main surfaces and edges will have a nice dark golden shine. From there, what we're going to do is shift through a couple of tones, moving closer to the edge with each colour. We're going to be going from the initial gold through highlighting in a mix of a purple with that gold. This can then be used to highlight the areas before we move again closer to the edges, this time using a pure metallic purple, and this should give us a nice transitional movement from gold up into purple. From there, we can push it a tiny bit further by taking a dark blue metallic and then going round and applying another transitional highlight. Finally, we're going to wrap up all of these metal areas by applying a very, very fine edge highlight of a very pale blue metal. When tackling these highlights on the model, we essentially want to make the most ethereal colours, so add all of the colours at the edges away from the hands, for example, so we get a nice transition of energy moving away from them. That gives us this really nice ethereal look, and we can do it to the scales on the tabard as well as any of the weapons. This overall is a really nice transition, but we do have another area on this model that still needs to be addressed, and it's a relatively large bit, and that is the cape. Now in sub-assemblies, this is nice and simple. We can paint both sides of the cape at the same time without messing up our paint job on the armor that we've done so far. So we can just pop that cape off and let's get started. And rather than painting it as it is in the box art, I'm just going to be going with plain pale white, the same as the Terminator squad that we've painted so far. For the cloak, this is nice and simple. We're essentially going to be painting it in a very similar way to how we painted the armor. Starting off with a mid-light brown tone, we may need a couple of coats to get a consistent, nice base coat. Once this is down, we're going to start to add in some medium to mild flesh into this brown and progressively add more of this flesh as we highlight the billowing robes more and more. Once we get to essentially pure mid flesh, we are going to then start to add in a little bit of light flesh, progressing more and more to the edges until we are using pure light flesh, at which point, as I'm sure you can expect, we are going to add in a little bit of an off-white for the brightest highlights on the most billowing sections as well as the edges. We also have the option to add some pure off-white to some of the most sharpest edges or some of the most billowy sections of the robe if we want to push it that little bit brighter. But here we've just stopped with a mix of off-white as well as our light flesh tone as our brightest highlight. That ties it in nicely with the rest of the models we've already painted. Now there are a couple of elements that we still need to do, and predominantly we've got a lot of yellows on this model that we still need to paint. Conveniently, we're going to be starting off the yellows using pretty much the same technique that we did for the cloak, except we're going to be cutting out the initial base coat of the brown, and we're just going to be basically giving a base coat of our mid skin tone, followed by a highlight of our light flesh tone. At which point, all we need to do is grab a wash and we can start tinting them to yellow. Once our highlighted skin base coat is down for all of our yellow areas, we can start to tint them either with a yellow wash, a yellow ink, or a yellow contrast. Thanks to the past highlighting we've done with the skin tones, this gives us a really nice, quick, simple yellow gradient. But on this model, we're going to push it a little bit further. To do this, what we're going to do is dig out a bright yellow paint and then do some final edge highlights using this yellow on all of those areas we've applied our wash. Lastly, let's touch up on the flames on this specific model. And here, I will admit we've slightly cheated. We kept the coloured zenithal on this section throughout the paint job, and we're going to use this to build out the smoke tones. We can take the bright turquoise we've used across the paint job and then slightly catch the edges of the brightest sections of smoke. Then what we're going to do is take a white contrast and slap this all over the smoky flame sections, which will tone it down slightly, as well as add that nice grey tone that we would expect to get from fiery smoke. At this point, the model is essentially done. We've got a couple of other elements on there, but it's just a case of picking the techniques and styles that we've done with the rest of it, and then applying it to those chosen smaller areas if we want to. Now, I really like how this guy came out, and that's not surprising. He looks a lot better than the Terminator that I already like the look of, but is that surprising? We spent 5 times roughly longer on this guy than we did on our one Terminator. So this is how they came out. Let me know, would you spend the amount of time that we spent on this guy on every model in your army? Or would you do similar to how we did, speed paint the troops and spend that little bit longer on the characters? I would be interested to know. Now, we still have some stuff to do for this combat patrol. We are going to be having to paint up some Zangors, and there are 20 of them in the box. So that one is going to be very much a excessive speed paint to get them done in time. So if you want to see more videos where we tackle combat patrols, I'd suggest checking out this one here, where we do similar sorts of things to this, tackling different armies, combat patrols in different types of ways. Otherwise, if you want to catch the Zangors, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.